All right, folks, so this is the new Zwift RIDE, and this is a pretty interesting new concept where this is an all-in-one indoor cycling setup that comes with everything that you need to get quickly riding on Zwift. Now, is this a smart bike? Well, sort of. But rather than being a single piece of hardware with everything completely integrated, there's two components to it. The Zwift Smart Frame and then marrying that to a compatible trainer, and in this case, the Wahoo Kicker Core. But the really unique thing about this setup though is the Zwift Smart Frame, which brings everything else to the setup, replacing a traditional bike, along with adding the functionality of Zwift Play controllers. So before we get into the Zwift RIDE, let's talk about the why behind this concept. So when it comes to indoor cycling, there's basically a couple different kinds of setups that you can have. You can have a direct drive smart trainer, and then you bring your own bike. And then there's also the other alternative of a complete smart bike, like let's say a Wahoo Kicker bike. And smart bikes have definitely gained a lot of popularity by being an all-in-one solution that can be a permanent indoor setup, but they also can be typically quite expensive. So that's why a lot of people use a direct drive bike trainer with a bike. However, many of us that ride indoors and ride indoors a lot don't want to deal with the inconvenience of mounting and remounting their bike every time we want to ride. So like for me, I actually just have one of my old road bikes that I have permanently mounted on my trainer so I can ride it anytime. So with the Zwift Smart Frame, so the concept here is to have an alternative to a real bike with a dedicated frame that's specifically meant to be an indoor bike all the time. And there's even more benefits to this than just replacing an outdoor bike, such as the ability to accommodate for different sized people since this is completely adjustable. And the Zwift RIDE is actually the evolution of the Zwift Tron bike that got leaked quite a while back, but the Tron bike was supposed to be this very premium high-end smart bike, and the demand for something like that isn't going to be as much as for something like this, where they're actually trying to keep the price as low as possible for someone who just wants a permanent indoor cycling setup. And that brings up the price, which is a really big part of the story. So the Zwift RIDE runs $12.99, but that's not just the Zwift frame. That includes the Wahoo Kicker Core trainer. So if we do some simple math here, so the Wahoo Kicker Core trainer currently runs around $500 without a 1-year Zwift subscription. And then the Play controllers run around $100. So that basically leaves around $700 for the frame portion right here. So can you get a used bike for $700? Absolutely, but the downside to a traditional bike is that that's really only meant for one size person, where with the Zwift RIDE, this can accommodate anyone from 5 feet tall all the way up to like 6'6". Now at launch, the RIDE is going to be an all-in-one package with the smart frame along with the Wahoo Kicker Core trainer, but a little bit later on down the road, they will be offering a frame option for those of you that do already have a compatible smart bike trainer. And that's another advantage of this concept, is that you can use the Zwift Smart Frame with a variety of trainers that are compatible. And at this point, those are going to be most of Wahoo Kicker trainers, the Zwift Hub, as well as the Jet Black Volt. Now, I very much like this concept, and I also think it's really good to ride, but there are some very notable things to consider with the RIDE, such as the fact that this is like 99% meant to work with Zwift, as you can imagine, as well as a few other things that we'll talk about here in just one bit. Okay, so when you get the RIDE, it's going to come in 3 boxes. So you'll have the main frame, another box with the components like the handlebars and pedals, and then the trainer. Now, I already had a Wahoo Kicker Core trainer, so they didn't need to send me that, but if you are buying the RIDE at launch in this complete setup, it'll come with everything here. And for the setup, they put a lot of thought in the process to make it as easy as possible. So first off, they even designed the box for the frame so you don't have to lift the frame out of the box, where it's a lift-off lid. And then inside the other box, you'll find stuff like the handlebars, the stem, the pedals, as well as some other stuff like the charging cable and some setup instructions. And along with that though, they have this one and only one Allen wrench that you'll need to get completely set up. Now, when we first pull the frame out of the box, there's actually some small details here that are kind of cool. So the chain is actually held in place with this little chain keeper at the axle so it doesn't touch the ground. And there's also this little rubber pad at the bottom of the frame which keeps the chain ring off the ground. And then for the trainer setup, there's really not much you need to do here other than using the 12 by 142 millimeter through axles, which just kind of slide into place. But the cog, which is going to be the single speed cog that comes on the Wahoo Kicker Core, is already pre-installed. And then from here, you just need to mount the frame to the trainer using the included through axle as well as the Allen wrench. Then you'll drop the chain onto the cog, then flip up this little orange chain tensioner that's near the chain rings. And then next up, you'll drop the stem into the frame. You'll use the included Allen wrench to tighten it down. And then this next portion is arguably the most complex portion of the setup process, is that you have to mount the handlebars by removing the front portion of the stem and then sliding the handlebars into place and then just replacing the cap. You'll next want to install the pedals, and they do include flat pedals inside the box, but a lot of you out there will likely have your own pedals. But again, to make it easy as possible, they have a little label on the side of the crank arms indicating the direction that you'll need to tighten them down, since it is going to be different from the drive side to the non-drive side. And then from here, you'll just need to get it adjusted for fit. And they have some baseline measurements on the setup cards, which will give you a good starting place. And for me, it was pretty close, but I did have to tweak things just a bit for my exact taste. And all in all, it should take you about 15 to 20 minutes to get completely set up, which is pretty good considering it's not a complete all-in-one smart bike. And once you are done with all the setup process, the included Allen wrench basically has this nice little home right here with the magnetic holder under the top tube. So the frame itself is a super sturdy steel frame that's powder coated, which they say they've tested thoroughly for sweat resistance. And again, kind of an advantage here versus a real bike where the salt from sweat can actually corrode components. So that really was a big aim with the Zwift RIDE frame, was to resist that sort of corrosion. This is a somewhat beefy frame though, so the frame itself is going to be around 38 pounds, and then if you include the trainer, I think the total weight is around 78 pounds. So moving the entire thing around isn't going to be super ideal, but you do have the advantage that this thing is modular, so you can take the frame off and then move the frame and the trainer around separately. But I'd argue that it's still definitely easier to move around than a dedicated smart bike, which you have to move all at once, which those can be like 80 pounds or more. And they could have made the frame out of aluminum, but that would have added additional cost. And one of the big aims with the Ride was to keep the cost as low as possible. And realistically, you don't necessarily need this to be super light since it's going to be living inside all the time. You just need to be light enough where it's not necessarily super inconvenient to move it around. But this is a very sturdy setup with a max rider weight of 265 pounds, and this thing isn't going anywhere, and it is super stable even for those harder sprints. And it has a single leg up front, which helps create a small footprint, and it's totally fine in regards to stability, as it's basically the same footprint that you'd have with a front wheel if you think about it. And I also do like the fact that it kind of makes the Ride look like a traditional frame where it looks like it's almost floating. Now, one important thing to note here though is that the frame isn't kicker climb compatible. So this black portion right here, this is actually just paint. This portion isn't removable. They said that they were considering having climb compatibility, but that would have added additional cost and they wouldn't be able to hit the price point that they wanted to hit. The foot on the bottom of the frame though is removable, and the reason for this is that they're going to have different feet, or a foot I guess you could say, that accommodates for different trainers since heights of trainers can differ. However, there currently isn't any word on kicker move compatibility with some sort of accessory that would allow the frame to move forward and backwards. So if you happen to have one of those trainers, you may not be able to use the frame when the frame is released on its own. And for the components, it uses a traditional saddle, so you could switch it out to your liking, but I have to say that I quite like the saddle that they chose here, which has a short nose with a medium amount of padding, and it also has a center channel to reduce pressure. And then these are also going to be standard road bars, so these are going to be 42 millimeters in width, and it has a 31.8 clamp. So again, you can go and replace those as you wish. And then up top, there's a nice tray for your phone, water bottle, as well as some snacks. Now, although it is big enough for some of those smaller items, it really isn't big enough to place your tablet. They do have a tablet holder available though, which will just kind of replace this front portion right here, but it is an optional accessory that runs 50 bucks. Now, probably the most unique part of the Ride though, and the frame, is that they have these special play controllers, which are kind of like play controllers on steroids, which take the place of traditional shift and brake levers that you'd have on a normal bike. So the controls up top remain the same as the original play controllers in regards to the D-pad and the A, B, Y, Z buttons, but the rest of the buttons have been reconfigured a bit. So for braking and steering, the rockers for these basically make up the entire front of the brake lever portion, and these are much bigger now since they kind of have the space where you'll push inside for braking and then outside for steering. The biggest change though comes with a new button configuration on the side where they now have 2 buttons, and the reason for this is that you can configure the Ride with different drivetrain configurations, where you can have sequential shifting, you can configure it to be Shimano Di2, or you can have a SRAM configuration. And then additionally, you can choose between different chainring and cassette configurations for mixed terrain, flat terrain with closer gear to gear ratios, as well as climbing or just gearing that may work best all around. My preference tends to be sequential shifting, where you basically have this entire gear spread to choose from rather than having to switch the front chainring per se, but it is nice that they gave all those options. But there's also these additional drop buttons down here at the end of the levers that you can use for special functions like dropping a ride on or using a power up. And I really quite like these because I tend to forget like which button, whether it's the Z button or the Y button, does the ride ons or the power ups. So yeah, these are really, really nice to have. The controllers themselves are rechargeable and they have up to 20 hours of ride time, and they charge via USB-C. However, one kind of odd thing I kind of noticed is that they moved the charging port to closer to the stem portion right here, where the original play controllers had the charging port in the controllers themselves, which kind of created a cleaner look, but I'm sure there's probably some reason they actually had to move that. They do come with a specific charging cable though that does integrate well throughout the entire setup, and they even include these magnetic cable holders that you can use to keep things a little bit tighter if you want to have the cables attached all the time. And then for the drivetrain, it's a single speed setup that's designed to be used with the Zwift cog. And the chain that it uses is a specific single speed chain that they've actually coated with a special coating that's supposed to actually not need any lubing at all. And it's supposed to last for like 10,000 hours or something like that. It uses a standard 12 by 142 through axle configuration, so in theory it can be used with basically any trainer out there. But the kicker, and pun intended, is that the trainer does have to be Zwift virtual shifting compatible to take full advantage of what the frame has to offer. Now the cog itself that's shipping with this all-in-one solution is actually an updated cog where they've refined the shape of the teeth to more closely match the single speed chain that they use, so it is a little bit quieter. However, you can use the original cog with this if you wish. Now, since it's a single speed configuration, it needs some way to tension the chain, and they have this kind of clever little chain tensioner down here, which basically just flips down, so you can actually take the whole frame off and stuff like that, and then when you put it on, it just tensions just like that. Kind of nice. And then the cranks, which are made out of aluminum, are 170 millimeters with a Q factor of 150 millimeters. However, you can't adjust the length of the crank like you can do on a lot of other smart bikes where they actually have like adjustable crank length from like 165 to 175. It is set at 170 millimeters. But again, adding an adjustable crank length system to this whole thing would have added quite a bit of additional cost. Now you'll actually notice that the non-drive side has something that resembles a chain guard just like the drive side, which is kind of an interesting design decision, but if you look closely, you can see that it actually hides the chain tensioning mechanism for a cleaner look. And then for a few other small but very clever little details with the hardware is that they do include water bottle cages here, but these water bottle cages aren't like traditional water bottle cages that need to actually keep your water bottle in place when you're riding outside. So these water bottle cages actually are meant to just be able to rest your water bottle in place for you to just grab them easily. So using this entire setup with Zwift will virtually be the same as using a traditional trainer along with their Zwift Play controllers, where you'll first pair your trainer with the game, then select your trainer to control resistance as well as provide cadence. And then all you do from here is go into the controls menu and then choose the ride as your controls. And if you have a heart rate strap, finally pair that up as well. And then from here, the experience is basically your all-in-one Zwift setup, where the ride will be great for everything from simulation rides and all their virtual worlds with varying terrain to all their workouts as well. And then the integrated play controllers that are on steroids provide seamless integration with the game without you even needing to take your hands off the handlebars at all. Now, one thing to note though is going to be for Apple TV compatibility with this whole setup. So with an Apple TV, it can be challenging since it only has 2 Bluetooth connections, and you'll use one of those connections for the trainer, then the other for the controllers. And if you want to use a heart rate strap, then you'll have to use the companion app. So that's something to consider with this. Now, along with the Ride's integrated play controllers though, you can also use the Zwift Click as well, all at the same time. In fact, this is usually how I actually like to use it, where I like to have the click right up here on the handlebars so I can actually shift when I'm on the tops. And another nice thing about this whole virtual shifting concept is that there's really no drivetrain, so there's really not going to be any noise when you're shifting gear to gear. And the responsiveness of shifting from gear to gear, it's not like quite like instantaneous as you may get on some higher end drivetrains, but it's very responsive overall. But when it comes to the overall sound, it's very quiet, but not necessarily completely silent either. So the chain with the actual cog and stuff like that, that seems to be very, very quiet, but there will be a little bit of resonance that you'll hear from the plastic portions in the cog, as well as the chain tensioner down here. But overall, it is a really quiet ride experience. All right, so here's a little sound check of the new Zwift RIDE frame with the Kicker Core Hub 1 with the updated cog on the back. In. So the cog itself, I can tell pretty much immediately that it's definitely quieter. Feels a little smoother too. But again, we're kind of talking about a new chain that they have here. It's kind of like a new drivetrain, but it's virtually silent. I mean, it's basically, it's going to sound like a very smooth drivetrain on a normal bike, basically. There may be a slight bit of a resonance from the plastic pulley wheel down there, but that's all I really notice. Increasing speed. Yeah, it's
pretty darn quiet.
But another thing to note is that it may be quieter than some drivetrain configurations with the 2x setup, where in the cross chain you can kind of hear those kind of grinding. Now, when it comes to accuracy, so that's really going to depend on the trainer itself, but I already have a full review of the Kicker Core trainer, which I'll have like linked down in the description below, but TLDR, it's a very accurate trainer and it really works well. Now, I really do like the Ride, and I think it's also a great value, and there's also some really clever things that they've done, but I think there's also a few odd things here and there, as well as some things to consider. And the first thing is probably Apple TV compatibility, where that can be a little bit tricky with the companion app if you want to use a heart rate strap. And then related to that is that it doesn't come with an included tablet holder. And there's also no Kicker Climb compatibility, but the most important thing to consider is that this really is meant to work best with Zwift. You very well can use this whole single speed setup with structured workout apps, but if you enjoy other simulation apps, that's not really something that's supported with something like this, at least currently. And I think one thing that's going to be kind of fun with this whole Ride thing though is how people customize it. And I'm not just talking about the handlebars of the saddle, I'm talking about like stickers on the side of the frame, or maybe some people may even go as so far as to paint it. But oh, and then one thing I forgot to mention is that the head badge is actually removable, so these could actually be customized in the future. Anyhow, I think the Ride is a pretty interesting concept with a lot of clever ideas, and I could definitely see this trend of like a bring your own permanent indoor frame sort of thing continue on in the future. Anyhow, if you have any questions about the Ride that I didn't cover in this video, feel free to drop those down in the comment section down below, and definitely let us all know your thoughts on the Ride as well if you're planning on getting one. In the meantime, happy riding, and we will see you in the next video.